Hello, everyone, and thank you again for joining this, our second edition of sketching the asynchronous class. And in this tutorial, we're going to talk a little bit about sketching with graphite, and we're also going to be talking about line weights. And so in this course, there will be a sketching as we have done in the past, of course. And also, I'll talk a little bit more about some of the things that will be discussed in the lecture as well. And so before I get into just going over some of what we're going to sketch today, I just want to take a moment to talk a little bit about line weights. And so in line weight, and you may have heard me speak a little bit about this in class, in two-dimensional drawing, there's a simple way of determining what is being cut, whether it's in section or elevation, and thinking about where that cut happens. The line weights that define those edges and materiality are drawn with a darker line. The darker line helps give hierarchy. It helps to make a drawing more clear. It helps to define things in a hierarchy of what's being cut, what's being seen in projection, and what is a joint or a third or a much lesser importance in terms of the line weights. So there is a way of thinking about this more artistically and in three-dimensional drawing. So the way that we help to define three-dimensionality and depth in drawings can be done through lines and tone. And so tone usually refers to shade, shadow, and a variety of ways of creating a field of tone and color. And line weight is a more simplified version of this. You can mix them together, of course, and that can give you another variation. And sometimes the idea of line weight in three-dimensional drawings can be a difficult thing for people to understand because it's not always as well defined as those line weights are in two-dimensional drawing. And so I'm going to draw a few diagrams here to show how these drawings can be read more clearly three-dimensionally using line weight. So, and I'll talk about this on Friday as well in the lecture. So first of all, maybe I can start off by saying that today we're going to draw the Jones College Prep, a high school here in Chicago, designed by Perkins and Will. I believe around 2006 or 2007. So it's been around for a while. It's in the South Loop. And it's obviously a very rectilinear building, a lot of folded planes, which lends very well to the idea of drawing perspective with line weights. And so we'll be focusing not so much on the colored pencil, the black that we did last week, but more with graphite today. So kind of starting off again with construction lines and then moving straight into line weights from there without having to do too much erasing, because again, we start off with very light lines. And so we're going to stick to graphite. And this is going to be the type of graphite that you're using is really dependent on how comfortable you are, the amount of force that you push upon your paper. That will dictate the type of pencil that works best for you. And for many of you, the number 2, the HB, will suffice because you have control over the amount of force that you're applying. And line weight will depend heavily on keeping your pencil sharp, of course, but then how much pressure you're applying. And then just understanding the consistency of maintaining a constant pressure depending on the line types that you're looking to use. So we'll come to this drawing in just a moment. But before we get to that, I want to take an opportunity just to kind of go over a few diagrammatic starting points. And so looking again at our object in space, if we're just starting with, again, near the base, we have a horizon line very low against the building that we're looking at, which is, of course, much higher than us. So we have, again, we just established, and moving kind of past those the initial ideas of horizon line and vanishing points. They will be with us throughout the semester. So even if I don't mention them, it's not to say that they're not there. But I'm not going to dwell on that every time. So just remember that those are there. And so when we're setting things up, this is the most simple way of defining an object. It's just a box. And we're kind of low in relationship to it. Our field of vision is quite low to it. And so a simple box And then if we start to look at this a little bit more varied, just like Jones has quite a few pieces to it. It's not just a box. It has a lot of pieces that are kind of carved out or additions. There's a box with a recess. A lot of shadows are created. The columns are poking through several different floors. We see different reveals, soffits, recesses, uh, places where you can actually see through the building. So almost like a hole in the roof there, but that is really just a frame and like a terrace that you can get to the outside and be on the roof. And so from there, let's just start thinking about ways of sculpting this form in a way that can give us a variation of styles for a three-dimensional drawing. A three-dimensional kind of different way of treating reveals and depth. So this is just an imaginary box that I'm just kind of playing with. Just making it up. All right. So kind of get the idea here. This is a kind of a boring building, but with some strange carving out of it. And then there might even be some deep recesses here, just trying to get as much variation as possible. And then just for fun. So these are kind of like the construction lines that I'm just coming across with some new geometries. Let's say this is just kind of hanging out as an addition. All right. Let me clean this up a little bit. So, those construction lines, this is how they come in handy. We're really just thinking about this as we go. We're not finalizing these lines just yet. All right. So this is, however it looks on camera, a messy drawing, which is just one line weight. And so as we're starting off, for a lot of us new to perspective drawing, this could be it. That's it. I got my perspective. It's working. It's fine. I can see that the geometries are relatively accurate to the relative to the horizon line and the vanishing point. But what if we wanted to, without doing tone, how can we bring this up to another level? Can we start adding line weight to make it appear more three-dimensional? So the easiest way to think about this is knowing that this building is sitting on a surface at grade, something very close to the ground. There might be a few places it might lift up, but anyway, it has a base. All buildings are sitting on something. And so that line, we're not going to worry too much about, but the outline, the other sides of this, the vertical walls, the edges of those walls and the roof, we want to make those appear darker. We want the line weight to be heavier in order to make this building, this object appear to kind of come off the page a bit more. So we're going to come back, and I actually have this, this is Blackwing Moleskin. Blackwing is a brand of pencil. It's a high quality, but they don't use the B's and H's like we have seen in other pencils. They just have hard and soft. So this they call soft, which is, I'm guessing, the equivalent of something like a 6 or a 7B, so very soft. So I don't have to apply much pressure here. But the Blackwing allows me to get a really deep line. You can see there. And I have a lot of them that came in the box, and so I actually have one that's sharp. I can really amp up that line weight, really just tracing the edge. And not worrying about the base, because the base is just a change of plane. And so the way, that's kind of the first step. So I'm looking now at the first lines I created. You could think of those as the medium line weight. I then jump to the second line weight, which is the heavy one. That's the profile edge. The profile edge is really any surface that you can put your hand behind. So an edge that you just see it, that you cannot, it's not a change of plane in the way that you're looking at two surfaces turning a corner. It's turning a corner, but you can't see the opposite side. So this, of course, the profile of the building is the edge. I cannot see the side that it's turning around, that is invisible to the eye as I see it in this perspective. But that line I know is going to be a profile line that I make the darkest. And it's not just the outline of the building. I also have profile edges, these two. So those are two other lines that I want to make a little bit darker because those are also profile edges. I cannot see the return face of those. Same goes for this. It's kind of ledge, as well as this one. And even on the edge here. So those are my dark line weights, profile edges. So profile is again the ones that you can put your hand behind, you cannot see the return face. The medium line weight I've already got. The medium line weight are change of planes. That is the medium line, which that line weight that yeah, I can see both faces. So it's just a change of plane. This is usually corners. So there's a corner here. There's a soffit. That would be the medium line weight. These are medium. And so right away, I have two different line weights. The one that I started just mapping it out, and then and then that would be considered kind of the starting point. You can use construction lines and then go back to make them a little more intentional. Either way, the second line weight. The third line weight would be a joint or a place where there are no change of plane at all. It's really just a definition of material or where two different things come together. So if you have a curtain wall, for instance, it's like the most generic curtain wall in existence, but that would be the very lightest. It might not come through so well on camera here, but this one, so this one would be the medium line weight because that's a change of plane. But then these are coplanar. So this is just defining a pattern or a way of defining joints within a material. And those would be the lightest line weight. You don't want to make those compete with the profile edge. That's not, you're not really building a three-dimensional object if you're making everything dark or everything light. And so here you can see again, well, hopefully you're seeing this as well as I'm seeing it in reality, is this one is the two again at the top here. That's change of plane where it's a profile edge. So I can only see the top of this object. I can't see the return face that is horizontal to the ground plane. The medium line weight is the change of plane where I see both sides, so that these vertical lines would both be that change of plane. And then the smallest line weight, that's really just material or joint patterning. If I have punched openings, this is really a judgment call where, let's say there's not any real recess, there's just a punched opening without a deep recess like we see in these two. These you could argue either way. Those could just be a change of plane or the medium line weight, or you could think of them as very minor, and so we use our lightest line weight there. So this is kind of just the most basic way of thinking about line weight. In addition to line weight, of course, we have the additional tools to us. And I did a little bit of this earlier in class last week where we were thinking about that building by David Chipperfield, and is using your pencil in a different way. Rather than focusing on the tip of the pencil, which gives you a hard line, it's not as easy to shade. It certainly takes longer time. And you're left with a lot of strokes to give you a consistent patch pattern or tonal pattern. I tend to use the side of the pencil where I have a much wider tip. And so here I can create very quickly tone, and I can even go back and start to emphasize different faces where they would receive light and where they would receive shadow. And so this is all very easy and simple to do in a graphite drawing. And I'm going quickly through this just to kind of prove the point. You have to be consistent. So if the sun is coming from this side, this is the sun. That side is, of course, going to be illuminated. And that means by default, the opposite side will have a tone, meaning it's in shadow. And we can even go so far as to say that a shadow is cast on part of this vertical face, kind of casting a shadow down. And eventually you build these up so that you realize the deeper the recess, the darker that tone becomes. And then it starts to gradually form a gradient to a lighter tone once it gets to the perimeter where there's more light. And then you can even start adding some of those tonal shadows in the foreground. And things like this, again, a darker tone for the shadow there. But it's always important to, as you do this, if you start ending up with two values that are very similar to one another, you want to try to kind of amp up one of those two so you can still see that edge. Because some of your line work, once you get into tone, you're going to start losing some of that line work because the value that you're creating with shadows is kind of overtaking that. So this is just a real quick way of thinking about using line weight and then going even beyond that. So sometimes you'll say, well, I like the line weight, I want a line drawing. That's fine. In other cases, you'll want to amp that up a little bit. You want to get a little bit more three-dimensionality. And so that's where these tones start to come in. So that's the kind of the great thing about using graphite is really that you have this huge variety of extremely light, thin lines to very heavy lines and shade and shadow all with the same tool. So, and pencils, of course, are everywhere. We don't have to worry so much about them breaking. They're not as soft as the Prismacolor pencils. And we can use everything from those, the HB, the middle of the road, to the B range and the H range to really give you a whole different variety of tones that you can work with. So again, you can really get a lot of really deep shadows if you're starting to use a very soft B, or this, whatever, just Moleskine uses, just this Blackwing soft. So that is really what I'm going to talk about now when we get into this drawing exercise, when we start thinking about Jones. And then, so as we dive into this, the first thing, you probably see some similarities between what I have drawn here and Jones, and that there's a kind of spaces that are carved out and some places that are added onto. So this could be a box form in the foreground at the base and the closest to us, a carved out, a slot, a soffit. It really has all these tricks. And so the first thing that we can see is when we look at this is where our eye is in relationship to the object. And so it's always simply, even if we can't see a horizon line, we know that it's there, and we know that it's parallel to the base of our image. So if we just come up here, it's almost like discovering where is everything truly horizontal to the page. And so I would say that that horizon line is right about here. And the floor to floor of Jones College Prep here doesn't really matter. You could say that this is probably taken from a building across the street, and we're probably on the third floor. Jones might have a very high floor to floor. So for as far as Jones is concerned, we might be on the second floor, but you could see this building across the street here has a much tighter floor to floor, and we're probably on the third floor there. And so with that in mind, you know, we can strike a line there. That's roughly where our horizon line is. Now, the vanishing points are well off the page. So those are going to have to be kind of estimated, unless you have a very large piece of paper or you have some other way of looking at this that you can start to see where those points actually meet the horizon line. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do with this is determine that horizon line roughly, I would say about a third of the way up my page. And the other thing to take note of in this image is that you can plainly see that I'm elevated. You can look down at the top of these cars. Like I said, based on where the horizon line is, I could tell I'm about 3 floors above street level. And I had been encouraging everyone to think about taking all of your images from street level or at grade, where your horizon line is very low. Almost like if you're a 6-foot tall person, the horizon line would be 6 feet off the base of the building. In this case, we're elevated. So the rules all still apply, but we're not as low as we normally would be if we were just walking by. So here we can see the horizon line is much higher. That means we're getting more foreground. We can see more of the street, the trees. There's a kind of, the amount of the foreground that we can draw from is enhanced because now we're looking deeper into the foreground. And I don't want anyone to get caught up with drawing trees and cars just yet. That's going to be for a later class. For now, we just want to focus on creating perspective. So I'm going to keep moving this image on and off screen here so we can just follow along, knowing that I'll highlight things as we go, and I'll bring that image back in. So like I mentioned, maybe a third, 2/3 top, 1/3 of your page at the bottom, we have that horizon line there. And now we just have to start thinking about proportions. So if I want to capture this image on my paper the same way that I have it printed on paper here, I want to start breaking down it's really a volume, a singular volume. Don't get hung up on all the little ins and outs as we set this up. So if I just want to focus on the volume, right, I start again with that leading edge. That's the edge that's closest to me. This corner is the closest to me. And I know that it is because it's the highest point on a rectilinear building. It's the closest to me. It looks like this one is also kind of coming out a little bit, this high point here and another high point there. But I want to start with this one because it's the most prominent. It's where the whole building really turns the corner. And so I'm going to start with that. And then I'm going to come across and start thinking about how this building is going to hit the base at the horizon line. So I'm just kind of estimating that angle. That angle, I'm trying to replicate that. That will help me determine where I'm kind of beginning. And again, I'm really obstructed a lot by all the foreground. These trees, I don't want to focus on that. I want to get my geometry set first, build this up, and then if I have time or if I really want to spend time on some of the foreground, I can come back, I can edit the fence, these trees, the light poles, all that kind of entourage that helps to make a image feel more lifelike. So for now, though, I'm just going to focus on, and so I've already determined a line here. That line will eventually come to the horizon line, and I have to remember that this point also has to go to that same space on the horizon line. So I'm going to try to identify something like this, where I know that this one is coming down at a much stronger angle relative to the base because they're both coming down to a point on this line, which is closer to being parallel to the base, of course, because we're closer to that in relationship to the base of the building. And then the same thing here, not focusing on the geometry of this kind of bump out. I'll get to that later. Same thing though, and there's going to be some buildings in the foreground. We don't want to focus on those just yet. So right now we kind of just have a shoebox. It's just a real basic form. And these are still the construction lines. I'm drawing them lightly, hopefully dark enough that you can make them out on screen. But this is starting point. So kind of like how the shoebox begins. So then we can start building on this. We can start sculpting it. So I'm going to start with these forms. There's a larger form at the top of the building and another relatively similar shape form in dimension at the bottom. And so if we start breaking this up, the middle of the building is roughly here. And so when I start thinking about these two objects, I want to think about them in a similar way. I'm going to just draw two lines here that indicate those two objects. And again, these are all parallel faces, a very gridded building, a lot of faces are parallel to one another. And I had debated about what building to draw for this today. And I want to keep it simple before moving on to more complex geometries, which don't rely so much on horizon line and vanishing points because the geometries are more complicated. And so those rules don't apply. I want to try to get everyone comfortable with some of these principles of perspective before we get into the more difficult or kind of rule-free options of architecture. And so right away, I can see that there are these large moves that the architect is making to create the form of this building. And so here I have a flat face. I know that the building doesn't have a flat face throughout, but I'm going to start using, I can identify this as my primary leading edge. That's important. And then I can start to understand that there is places where their building is kind of pushing in and out. And so here you can start to see that there's a little bit of a glare in there. So I'm pushing this line in, whereas I started here, so because I know that's recessed, and then this again will push out a little bit further because this face that I'm now drawing is outboard of the original kind of box that I drew. And so these are again still the construction lines. I don't want to push too hard. I'm not committed to anything just yet, so I want to just keep things loose. After some time, I might realize, oh, the proportion of something isn't working out. And right away, I can start to see something develop here in my sketch. There's a kind of three parts to this, 1, 2, 3, with a reveal between each one of them. So it's kind of like 3 parts plus 2 that are minor. If I did this now, I'm starting to see that this one in the middle might be a little small relative to the top and the bottom. And so I might want to just correct course a little bit. Maybe I want to just give a little bit more breathing room to some of that in the middle to make sure I'm not squeezing it down too much. And I can easily do that because I've got these construction lines set up, and I can just come right back in like this. And there's a kind of spandrel panel that divides this. So I'm just trying to break it down into easy to understand chunks. So I know that's a construction line. I'm going to come back and I'll probably clean that up. And now I'm starting to see those three parts coming together. And the one in the middle has a spandrel panel, a kind of ribbon that moves about the building. And actually, this one in the middle goes the entire length of the building, as does this one. So those, I have these two boxes that are kind of interrupted in the middle of the building, but this bar towards the center reaches all the way from one end to the other. And then I can see that there is a kind of salmon colored frame piece here, which steps down from my original box. So I'm going to shave off a little bit here. Again, it's a one story. So now I'm seeing the relationship at the base. Come down. This ribbon reaches across. I know that there's a kind of triple height space here that identifies the entry condition into the lobby. And so there's another bar that's kind of protruding out like this. And remember where I identified the horizon line, this edge is beneath the horizon line. So we're seeing that line moving down from left to right. And again, I could start modifying things based on the geometries that I'm setting up. I might start to push and pull a little bit of this and that. And now I can start to see some depth. So I can see soffits. I can start to lay out some of these columns. And when I'm drawing a large building, I don't often want to count so many of the floors. It's not an important thing to understand because it's a repetitive thing. It's more about the proportion of the building. But in this case, I might want to count just the number of columns because it's not that many. It's easy to do. And if you start putting only 2 or 3 here and there's actually 5, then you're kind of impacting a lot of the architecture that you should be capturing. So here I can clearly see that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns supporting this. And then I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9 columns the rest of the way. And remember, the further you get away from your point of view or perspective, those columns will appear to be gathering closer and closer together. And then as an organizational tool, they also reveal themselves beneath this kind of central grouped floors. Seeing that I'm ahead of myself. I see that actually there are columns that extend here. It's a little difficult to make out exactly where the facade exists. It looks like this is all coplanar, but the columns are exposed here and not exposed here, or they're painted black or they're within the curtain wall. So these might just end up becoming the vertical mullions. I'm not making out those same relationships of columns up above. So, but I am certainly making them out here. So these I will be carrying through as columns. And they come all the way down to the base. There are some ribbon windows here. It looks like another vertical slot here and here. So we're just kind of filling in the places that we know we have some geometries that are behaving differently. A slot again here. And then again, this is actually cut back. You can see I had drawn a line here for that perfect box that we started out with, but now we're carving into it. So this line is actually pulled in. And a little bit of a soffit there and a curtain wall. I should say a ribbon window. And then another section that's taken out here for a deep, very deep recess. So before adding a lot more detail, I can see right away, everything's going to have depth, and we'll build that up in a moment. But this is kind of like at the point where I'm comfortable with where things are. There's no base yet, there's no context, there's no trees. But this is where you could start to ask yourself, how much context do you want to show? How much detail? What are the trees going to be? Are you going to add those trees, or are you going to leave them out? I can add them, and I can start to designate where the curb line would be, knowing that this is all vanishing to that same point. So the closer these lines get to us, the more the angle is going to be more severe. I think there's what appears to be a kind of median here, which also has a concrete barrier. It's a built-up planter. And then in the foreground here is another older building that is beneath our eye line, because it's beneath that point. That horizon line is just above. I think this might be an old lecture hall or assembly space. It has a kind of, this line tells me that it's some raked of some kind, because it's not flat. You can see that it's actually rising up at a different way than its adjacent horizontal line. So I can see this older building has a lot of repetitive windows, and so I can see that this is actually behaving a little bit different than the rest of the drawing, and so that's kind of flaring up. And then an older, the rooftop of this building, it has a kind of pop up here for probably some machine room. It used to be a water tower, which is no longer. And then over here, we could start thinking about the adjacencies of these buildings too, but not to spend much time on it. They're just really there for context to show that this building isn't just hovering in space, but it actually has neighbors. And I'm just kind of showing the kind of edges of these trees. I don't want to get into the detail of them, certainly not yet. Just kind of designate where I will be adding a little bit more. And in the median, let me see as well. All right. So now this is where I'd be pretty comfortable moving into a more permanent type of line way. We have our construction lines. We're pretty happy with the way this is looking. And if not, go back. Before you go any further, go back. If things don't look quite right, you have the image there. Just start making those changes now, because once you start getting a little bit more final lines, then you're gonna kind of wonder, what went wrong, and it was too late, and then you got to start over. Or just try to avoid as much wasted time as possible. So now I'm going to go in with more intentional lines. You can use the same type of pencil you've been working with. So we're just working with graphite again. We're not going to look at color pencil. But right away, I can say, okay, I can see some lines here that I don't want to exist, because those were part of our construction lines. So I can see right away this. I can start to say, no, that's not there, because the building dipped down in that location. It's not holding that line. And then a few more up here where it did the same thing. We carved into it and we popped this part of it out. The horizon line, if you're comfortable with your geometries, you can get rid of that too. All right. Again, the kneaded eraser comes in handy. You don't have to worry about all that mess. So one interesting thing, and if you don't really draw a building, you're not perhaps looking at it as closely, and probably studying a building for an hour just by walking by it. But this building is interesting in it has this feature of ribbon. So you can actually trace this line. It's kind of like either a spandrel panel or just a metal panel enclosure, which can act as a slab edge. But you can see, you can trace it around, and it actually zigzags all the way over and down to grade. So you can actually trace that line up, over, and around as a kind of ribbon. And so this is a strong design feature to this building, and you can actually enhance that in your drawing. You can make it more apparent. You can give it more emphasis than it deserves, or that the original design had. And so I'm going to go straight to my heavy, darker line tone, line weight here, and emphasize that ribbon. It has a consistent width to it. Don't want to go too wide or narrow along its entirety, along its path. But I want to emphasize that. So this is going to be, you can use your ruler, of course. Even sketching, you can use ruler, but I just for sake of time and describing this, I'm going to try to freehand it. True accuracy is not the goal. It's about the idea of what you're seeing. And this is a ribbon. And some of you might say, no, I don't like that ribbon. I'm not going to emphasize that. You can do your own way. That's fine too. So right there, you can see, oh, that's really, really strong. And then also I'm actually going to do something else here. I try to create I kind of dramatized some of these things. So I went back to my thinner line right here, but there's this salmon colored object is really powerful too. And then this ribbon turns back. It creates the sidewall of this. So just going over those initial construction lines with more intentional lines. And the columns are very, very, maybe it's a good time to mention too, now that I'm going into more heavy line weights, that graphite is softer and it'll have a tendency to get messy. This is where, and you can maybe already see on your hand, you might be having some pencil lines and you might be seeing some ghosting or clouds on your drawing. You might want to get another piece of pencil or paper to rest your hand on so that you can avoid some of that. So I'm just going to go in and start adding a little bit of depth to these columns, knowing again that they're getting a little bit further apart the closer they get to me. This object also has a bit of a frame to it. So because this is a small image, there are sometimes things that I'm guessing on. They might not always be 100% true. There's a lot of dark in this print, so I can't really see exactly what's happening here. It looks like there are some louver banks both here, and then some glass in between. It's not really that critical when that is all in shadow like that. Sometimes you become the architect and you have to kind of design yourself what you can't see. But just making some of these lines more intentional. And then again, here there's a kind of ribbon window. We're coming down, we're just going along with what we've got, making those lines darker. All right, so then, like I mentioned at the start, some of these really mullions are going to be those change of plan lines. Those are going to be the ones that we're just going to draw as light lines similar to your construction lines. I'm not going to count these mullions, but I do want to make sure that I'm grouping a lot of them vertically together. And then I can just see that they're broken up into a series of 5 panels. Again, it's not really that critical how many you break this up into. And those verticals, the lighter of the line weights, you could probably start to see how the different line weights are making this building read differently. Even these joints, these metal panels, of course, all have joints. It might even be very difficult to see, but they too have a kind of vertical orientation to them here and here. And so those would be very light lines. We do not want those to read even as heavily as the adjacent mullions on the curtain wall. And even sometimes they don't have to continue. They can be discontinuous as if you're picking your pencil up and it's kind of just an illusion of a continuation of that panel. And again, I'm not going to count all these joints. That's not the point of the drawing. But what I am going to do at the end is go back and add a little bit of tone to make this appear more three-dimensional. A lot of verticality on each of these. I know that this is masonry. So this is being represented in metal panel. It might be metal panel plate or ACM. This is masonry. They shouldn't be represented in the same way. And at this distance, at this scale, this would be like thousands of little horizontal lines. I don't want to draw 1,000 horizontal lines, so I'm just going to start giving the lightest kind of line weight to this as a kind of almost a hatch. And eventually a lot of these lines are going to go away because I'm going to shade some of this, but I don't want to represent them the same, and I don't want to just leave it alone. So we could even, there's quite a bit more verticality. So I'm going to just go quickly and do some of these vertical lines indicating mullions. And I want to respect that ribbon. I don't want to take these, even if there's a continuation of that mullion pattern between these two levels, I don't want to just carry it through. I'd rather interrupt it, even if it means they're not totally aligned with one floor to the other. I think it's more important in my drawing to indicate that ribbon. And again, the closer they get to us, the more spaced out they become. So again, so here, I'm probably going to leave this to be, because it's so dark, I can hardly make out exactly what's going on, but it appears as though somewhere about here there's a break in the louver and there's a curtain wall that continues. So the curtain wall has a consistent vertical orientation to it, whereas the louvers are very, very tightly, almost like the masonry section down below, just a series of very quick horizontal lines. And this is probably a mechanical floor with a lot of air is moving from inside to out or outside in. So this is like, and again, these dark areas, as a line drawing, this can be difficult because if you can't see everything that's going on in these darker sections, you kind of have to make it up. So all I can tell is, and I was just using a pencil that's very hard, and so I wasn't able to see that line very well. I got to make sure that I come back to this. All right, so this is getting to a place now where I'm feeling pretty comfortable with where things are looking. And so I might say, all right, I'm going to just start, doing something to the foreground, adding some trees, those cars, really getting some more foreground into this. And I'll probably give a lecture or two about utilizing, like, how do you draw trees? The worst thing you can do if you have a tree, please do not ever do this. Don't do that. We will talk about this later. You might, for now, something like this. Don't, and I'll talk more about this in another lecture, but just very, very simple. Don't do this kind of swirly stuff that looks very, very messy. Basically just vertical for the trunk and a few kind of quick movements off to one side and the other. But for this class today, I don't really want to get into those details just yet. Everybody develops their own way of drawing landscapes and trees, and so this is not the purpose of this. I'm just trying to develop an edge where that foreground ends and the building starts. All right, so and then don't want to spend too much time on the neighboring buildings because they're really just a complement to the building that I'm focusing on. But again, there's some of that construction lines. I know I don't want to see that. This is a continuation of the metal panel. And remember, with each line, they should all be vanishing towards those 2 points on the horizon line that we established at the start. And then very, very, very light. Again, that's your lightest line weight. That's the one that is joints. 2 materials, similar usually, that come together in panels like this. I cannot make, this appears to be the recess of a curtain wall, and I cannot see the joints, but I'm just going to make it up, and I'm probably going to end up coming back and making that a deep recess in value and tone. All right. So this is really the basics of this drawing, and if I'm going to just talk about line weights for one last time before jumping into value, I can start thinking about the heaviest line weights, again, the profile edges. The columns would have that. Sometimes columns, of course, you're seeing a circular object or a square object, and I usually, if they become too tightly spaced together, you can just barely see both sides. I just make one side a heavier line weight and not think about both. This is open to sky. And again, this is going to be a heavy line weight because that is a profile edge. All right, so then, and we'll talk about this a little bit more on Friday in the lecture, but now, no matter what is happening with the orientation of the sun and the object that we're looking at, I always try to make the primary face of a building appear in light. And it appears that this is actually just following that rule as well, because I could see this secondary facade is in more shade than the primary facade where the entrance is. So I'm going to use this as a guide and talk about how the light will be hitting this face on the left and leaving the opposite side in shadow. And so right away I can start determining, and again using more of the side of my pencil here, those faces that are facing north are all consistently in shadow. Now remember, there's that ribbon. That ribbon that I see that I follow along all the way from the top to the base of the building on the opposite side, that I do not want to shade, and it shouldn't be in shade. And now when I get to this edge, I have a very large expanse of facade that is in shadow. I want to take care at the edges, and then using the side of my pencil, I can get a very even tone. But and it's important not to move too fast through here because it can end up looking very messy, or your hand is going to run across that. and getting rid of some of that line work to make it look more uniform. And if you want, you can always go back and you can actually, there are blending pencils or even your finger if you are willing to do that. And this is what I believe to be kernel, but you can see that some of your line weight you will lose as you do this. You're not going to see all of that detail. You're going to blending it away. And so if you want that metal panel to read, you might have to come back and add a little bit more tone to that. I always, as a rule, try to make my soffits appear the darkest because they're never getting direct light from the side. They're usually in shade. And this space will always be in shadow towards the north again, just being consistent with where my building is being lit. And then I try to come back. I know that glass, because unless it's an image taken at night, the glass will usually come in as being darker than the rest of the building. So you can see this is extremely dark because it's not only in the north, but also there's a very deep recess there and there's glass at the end. Glass here also darker than the rest of its neighboring metal panels. And then even these are all interestingly a few different colors. It's like a white spandrel, a kind of grayish green spandrel, and then clear vision glass, which actually appears darker than any of its neighbors. And so I can see like this, for instance, is a ribbon of glass that runs from top to bottom. I just fill that in. And I would add a little bit of tone here because it's still, even though it's facing the east, it's still getting primarily in the shadows. And now here, it's really up to you how you want to represent this. But like I mentioned, there are these three different tones. So I would just start coming in and adding some different patterns. Oh, yeah. This is all glass. And then the same thing, you can just kind of go down. And I'm using the side of my pencil here because it allows me to create very fast, thick lines. The idea here is not to replicate exactly what's there. It's about the spirit of what the architecture is about. So I'm not going to go in and start counting every single one of these and make sure the spacing is right. That's not the point. Don't drive yourself crazy. If you want to do a drawing that takes you, 8 hours, then you can do that. But for sketching class, this is not what we're looking for. And even here, up at the top, I think this is actually the gym space. This is the gym. This is a swimming pool, which is probably why there's a mechanical room underneath it, because you're not going to have much head height underneath that pool. And then this box is the auditorium. So that pattern we can, and I'm trying to not waste time by sharpening my pencil, so shame on me. You should be taking time to do that. I'm trying to use many different pencils. This pattern. That, and then I'm going to go back and I have to make sure now, to make sure that these columns all stay as being outboard of their neighbor, which is much darker behind. I have to make sure that I'm not going over them. I have to respect those edges and add tone between the columns. So this whole floor, I want to make sure that I'm emphasizing the darkness of the soffit without going across where we have columns. And then in between columns, adding a little bit of tone, because that's a deep recess space. And then again, this is really deep shadow as well. So I'm going to again use the side of my pencil to try to create a field of tone within there. And then this again has this pattern. Moving fast through this just to show a kind of completed project here. So again, you might want to go back and add a little bit of that tone, that line work, because you may have lost some of it when you added that tone. And actually, if you want, you could even come back with your black colored pencil because you can get that really dark quality of that line work in there. Here, I might want to really emphasize the fact that this glazing turns the corner, but I don't see that verticality anymore, so I want to come back and add that. And so this is really the level of detail I would like to see. And some of you may have seen that today I assigned points to one of your first assignments, the one that we did last week on 880-860 Lakeshore Drive. If you have any questions on how I assign points, of course, please feel free to give me send me an email or speak to me after class on Friday and we can talk about it because I really want everyone to succeed, but I need everyone to put in the time and the work to make these drawings something that you're proud of. And I'll talk about examples of what's working and what's not working in class on Friday as well. So in this, I've talked a bit about line weight. And so that's the idea of just the line drawing without tone, but you can add tone again on top of it. In this drawing, I would come back and start adding a little bit more of the foreground landscape as well as some of the context that you see around here. So just very, very lightly kind of coming back and adding some openings for windows, just rectangles that aren't really giving too much detail because I don't want to detract from my object that I've created here. This is the focus of the drawing. I certainly don't want to start adding as much detail on my context, which takes away from what I'm looking at. And again, I don't want to focus too much on this foreground. I don't want to just look a lot on this tree. There's a lot of busy stuff that people can get lost with when looking at trees or different contexts. You can always come back and add a little bit of tone to the neighboring buildings just to show that those are behaving in the same way, where light is hitting that one face on the left and then the right-hand side is being cast in shadow. And actually, the same thing would apply, a very fast way to render trees if you don't the time or energy or really focus the need to really extend a lot of effort into that is really just coming back and doing the same thing. You know, a tree is a series of branches and leaves that are also casting shadows in the same way that a building does. So one side of that tree is in shadow and the other one is in sunlight. And so this is kind of like the most basic way of indicating trees. And you could even go so far as adding a little bit of a shadow just on the edge there. I know that there's all sorts of, there's like a fence here and I can come back and add that a bit later. You can add, you know, a little bit of the edge of the sidewalk to show that this building is in fact sitting on a surface, an urban streetscape. And so this is really about as far as I would expect people to take this for about a 45-minute drawing. And it just shows the kind of level of how much contrast you can bring up into these drawings and really not much more would be needed to kind of get the idea across. You could of course spend a lot of time on these drawings and becomes more of a drawing than a sketch, and we're going to try to focus on more quick drawings. And I'm going to bring my sketchbook, the one that I did in this class when I was an undergraduate. I was in grad school. But anyway, I'll bring the sketchbook and we could talk about some of the things that work there and how much time to commit to each one of these. And so I think that from here, this is a good stopping point. I think that with this, it's a good example building to talk about line weights as well as tone, shade, shadow. I'll work a little bit more on it and then I'll bring it in if anyone wants to take a closer look on Friday. And as always, this will be one of the 2 drawings that's due on Friday, or on Saturday at noon. This along with the other drawing that we will be working on in class on Friday. So I will be posting this now. It is Wednesday night, and so by Thursday you should have this and work on this up until Saturday. Or, just take an hour out of your week and do it before then so that you don't have to rush doing 2 drawings simultaneously. All right, so thank you, everyone. I hope this has been helpful, and I look forward to reviewing some of your drawings of Jones College Prep. Thank you, everyone.